we're going to run through this quick exercise, and we're going to give, talk through the answers and everything. This is one that when we run through it with groups, with teams, anywhere from 5 to 25 people in a room or something like that, and start to ask what their answers are and where they would prioritize things, and how they would think about the improvements and how to prioritize improvements. There's usually, 2 to 3, people in that room that will get, there is one right answer. There's a lot of very valid answers. There is one just, kind of right answer that's here. And so most of the time that's kind of what the range is. So there'll be maybe, 5% or so of the people will see that. That's what you're looking for. So we're just going to talk through this, and by the way, nobody should ever get this wrong. And again, and we'll have to come up with a different group exercise, I guess, now that we're making this totally public. So pretty simple. Production flows sequentially, A through F, through the business. Business is profitable. Your mission is to keep it growing profitably. 2 things that we know about each workstation is the production rate, the kind of per hour capacity, and we know their time on tools, as a percentage, which is kind of a proxy for efficiency. You can make an argument to say, Sue works faster than David, this and that, but when you really look at field productivity, the very first starting point, the biggest loss of productivity is if David or Sue if we aren't working because we don't have material or information or what have you. So time on tools is a really good proxy for efficiency. So I knew you loved this exercise. Anything else you want to bring up before we kind of go through what the numbers are and start walking through the answers?
No, it's very fun to watch this exercise play out in a couple of ways. One is, again, just visually like this. Another is if you've got a team that maybe is having an identity crisis, and you want to walk through it together. This is also great in person with, a pile of Legos. But it serves a lot of purposes when we do this in person and as an exercise.
So the and this is the basics. This is where it starts to see where your bottlenecks and where your constraints are in the organization, and it doesn't get any simpler than this. So just know that it's interesting to watch, like Sue said, the teams and how they react. So here's what we know: workstation A, it's got, and you don't have to know what they do. I mean, the icons are just there; they're just icons, But we know it's where it starts. It's got a production capacity of 12 per 12, so per hour per day. It doesn't really matter what it is. And time on tools, 85%. B, 10, capacity of 10, 98% time on tools. Really, really good. C, 14. So they got quite a bit of throughput capability. They're 75% on tools. D, 9 and 95%. They have a lot of time on tools. E, they have capacity of 11. And they have 80% time on tools, and F, 15 and 78% respectively. So then, this brings us to the question of which workstation would you focus your resources on first for profitable growth, and why? So I don't know, Sue, should we talk through some of the different answers that we've heard before?
Well,
we want to talk about a few of the different answers that we got, and they're all valid. They all sound really good. A few of the answers, and then we'll kind of go into the how do you analyze this for bottlenecks and constraints.
So one that I frequently hear is people taking a look at this and looking at the throughput, looking at the time on materials or time on tools, and usually there's a consensus or some consensus in the room. A few people that get together and say, well, C is the place we should be because we're at a 75% time on tools. And if we could move that up into the 80s or 90s, then suddenly, we've got that much more time on tools. So our efficiency is that much better. So that's where I hear a lot of the ops guys go immediately there. David, I'm sure you've heard other ones as well, but that's the one I hear the most.
Yeah, C is probably the most common one from the ops people, and yes, because they ain't busy. So, the other ones that I heard that I think are super valid are start with A. I mean, it all starts in the beginning. Well begun is half done. Just last week, we were spent a lot of time talking about how much time we should spend on the award to start portion of a project. So like for the role that manages the project managers, we were really laying out leader standard work for what they do. And they have a finite amount of time. They work maybe 50 hours a week, and on average, and they've got to deal with project escalations and personnel issues and all those things. So you got to really say, like, what should they do? And a lot of it does come down. A job well begun is half done. We do hear a lot of start with A, just because well begun is half done. I hear a lot of F, because like, make sure that it's right and tight before it goes out to the customer. So that's a super valid answer as well. And then yes, we see some B's thrown in sometimes because of, like, they're right up there, like there's no more, they're working all the time and they're working really hard. And some E, because E's pretty low as well, as far as the time on tools and as far as the throughput rate. So anyways, those are the answers that we hear. So now let's go talk through, how to really analyze this just from a mathematical standpoint. So definition-wise, a bottleneck is any resource with capacity less than or equal to the demand of the next step in the process. So, from A to B, for instance, A's can do 12 and B can do 10. So 10 is a bottleneck, right? Because you'd have 12 marbles going through and they only have the capacity to process 10 of them. And so when you look at it from that standpoint, then B, D, and E are all bottlenecks, and so that's the bottleneck analysis. Now you go through and you say, okay, what's the constraint? A constraint is the bottleneck that absolutely limits the performance, and in that case, it's D, because it's the narrowest of the bottlenecks. So think about it, no different than a plumbing pipe or whatever, a water main. Water's only going to flow through the narrowest point in that water main, the end. So you have to work on relieving it. Now, there's some qualifications to that answer, and the qualifications to that answer would be one of two things. One would be that if, for instance, an improvement, if, for instance, increasing the capacity of D was only going to take 2 months to go do, but improving the capacity of B or E was going to take 3 or 4 months, you would actually start the improvements to B or E sooner than you would start the improvements to D, because you're going to be limiting the flow. And so you have to kind of know this is where it's important to be able to go, okay, I've identified the bottlenecks, I've identified the constraints, I've also identified the improvements, the resources required, and the estimated timelines for those, so you can sequence those optimally. The other one is, this is just like one piece of the flow. So if the external market doesn't have demand for more than 9, then realistically you're better off going to focus to level your flow. That's what the term would be, is level your flow through the whole system and right size your production. It's probably going to be cutting back on some people. It's going to be reassigning and having certain parts of the task done by other areas. So leveling out, for instance, between C and D could just be shifting some task over. And I think that's what you were alluding to earlier, was going, when you're doing the math on this, sometimes just going, okay, these 3 tasks have to be done. Should it be done by the project manager? Should it be done by the project engineer? Should it be done by the, accounting? Should it be done, who should it be done by? And a lot of the tasks, when you really line them out, can be done by various people, and you should look at that from both who can do the task the best, but also how does it level out the flow across your organization? So I don't know if that was long-winded response, but Sue, how do you describe this when you're going through it?
Well, the visual part of this whole thing is just like you said, right? It's easy to get to 9 when you take the efficiencies off the bottom, right? When that second row of information of time on tools is gone, it's so much easier to see this. I've actually seen this exercise where they were talking about building a plane, and all of these A through F are different ways or different parts of the plane that have to be put together. And the minute you start assembling that plane, it comes out very clearly that D is your constraint, because you can see everything building up. E and F pretty soon have nothing to do, and everything is landing. It's just coming in the door of D and just sitting there. So again, trying to help see the visualness of this sometimes can help bring that whole team together to see, where they are. And you're right, that whole job role thing, right? If it makes sense to move some tasks from one job role to the other, trying to keep job roles working in their highest skill set, how can you move the rest of those around so you can even out the flow throughout the project, throughout a division, or throughout the whole company? You'll start to see these things level out as well. So the constraints will move, right? The constraint will move from one thing to the next then, as you start to level those out a little bit more.
You made a killer point on both the Lego exercise and the plane manufacturing. And here's where you would see that super clearly with both the Lego exercise or the plane in a manufacturing environment where you had very distinct work cells. You would see the buildup, because you would actually see, you'd go to workstation B and you would look over at the inventory, and there would be a stockpile of excess inventory building up that would continue to go build. And so it becomes very visually easy. I mean, well, I shouldn't say easy. It becomes visually easier to go see that you don't have level flow going through the manufacturing facility or the Lego exercise when you're doing that physically. Where it gets difficult, kind of the business of building, all of the building part is physical, and it's harder to see workstations A through F on a construction site because they're constantly
Right.
moving around. So that makes it a little bit more difficult to go see the flow. But then when you move into the office, we're in the virtual world, and it's very, very hard to go see the ebbs and flows and the bottlenecks. So where it shows up is, somebody going like, I can't get my contracts processed. Contracts just isn't moving fast enough, or accounting's going, well, I can't get the budget out of the project manager. I can't get this right. Those are all signs of unlevel flow going through the organization.
Right.
And so, but they're really, really hard to go see, right? They're in, if you looked at my email, you'd see how many unread emails I have. Those are, that's kind of the equivalent of inventory buildup for a white collar
Yeah.
job.
Yeah.
So, so anyways, that's the bottlenecks and constraints part. The task efficiency that Sue alluded to, that's also really, really important. So and we're going to talk about that as we dive in a little bit further as we talk about the continuous improvement cycle. So you always want to be looking for task level efficiency and leveling out the flow and making these small continuous improvements. But it's super important to know that that's something that always has to happen, but that does not guarantee business level outcomes. So, if you have a major bottleneck, a major constraint going on, no matter how efficient all the other workstations are, within the business, you can still have really poor or highly variable business level outcomes. So super important. Same thing at the project
Right.
level. So, so anyhow, that's part one, and that just gets a little bit more complicated. But this in itself is quite a bit of a stretch to be able to see that. So now we go further. So if you remember back to the second one that we did, where we talked about kind of the contractor's business model, and you've got, as you're looking at it, you have all these different parts of getting a project from identifying your market strategy to what do you want to go after, to your prospecting, and turning it into an opportunity, and turning that opportunity into a cost estimate and winning that, and then turning that into a project, starting up the project and working through. So you've got that kind of series of events that go on, and then you've got these supporting functions like purchasing and equipment and HR and accounting and all these things that all have to work together. So each one of those kind of segments has its own bottlenecks and constraints. But then when you look at the whole system working together, it's got one of those that actually becomes the constraint on the system. And we just talked about how incredibly hard that is to see, just say in like the project manager flow. And when it's virtual, this is now backing up and looking at the entire organization, and this is still just looking internal. incredibly difficult to go identify the constraint, but also the most valuable thing you can do, because all other prioritization is some level of sub-optimization. It won't have impact on the overall business. So I don't know. This is probably the biggest thing we work with contractors on, is helping them really see where do we put our
Right,
pressure.
right.
Uh, so,
Well,
yeah,
the what I tend to see is, and my background, of course, is heavy civil, but the contractors that have, heavy equipment, you tend to see it at the, in this particular slide, in the M or N, you start to see it at a higher level, especially when you're starting to talk about equipment resources, right? You've got a crane, or you've got two or three cranes, and those two or three cranes have to be on all of these jobs. And the jobs, they're looking at their critical path one way, but really the company critical path is where those cranes can actually go. And it's funny because people don't necessarily look at that crane as that whole theory of constraints and how it's being applied, but that's exactly what it is. They just haven't necessarily learned to call it what it is, but they're starting to see it when they know this asset physically cannot be on both of these jobs at the same time. Therefore, it is the constraint for each of these functional areas to move forward. And it's almost the Legos in much larger fashion when you've got when you've got pieces of equipment that physically cannot move to this other job, and now you see the theory of constraints in play. So just giving it the words that it really is would, I think, really help contractors to see it in more cases. Not just call it, hey, we've got this one crane and we can't do that. It's, this is our constraint. Learning that language around what this thing really is. It's not about the crane, it's about the constraint that crane creates. And learning to call other things, constraints and bottlenecks helps them to see it, I think, faster than not
yeah.
using the language.
It all breaks down
Yeah,
to
it
Legos,
does.
right?
It all breaks down to Legos.
You should, all, but much of life. And so the theory of constraints, there's a book called The Goal, and it was essentially this guy's life work. I mean, but The Goal was the first where he was articulating the theory of constraints. It's kind of a fun read. It tells a story of taking over a factory and doing a turnaround, and then there's several follow-on works from that, and actually his daughter is continuing the work in that area. It is a really, it's very difficult, first of all, to see the constraint in a complex system. And you in a complex system, you start to look external towards your customers and downstream towards your supply chain, and we could have a whole discussion on supply chain and current state of that. But so just identifying it's really critical. And then there's the human aspect of it that's also really difficult, because like in the case of that crane, yeah, that crane is a physical thing that has operating parameters and everything like that, and so it's this physical thing and you're talking about it. But sometimes we forget there's a who that sits up on top of that crane that's operating that crane. And when you start to talk about that as a constraint, there becomes a lot of pressure and a lot of scrutiny around that resource. And if you don't have your culture set to where like everybody's going to be the constraint at some point in time, that doesn't mean that the person's a bad person, but boy, are they going to get a lot of management scrutiny. There's a lot of excess stuff that goes into that, and it's not bad, it just is. But culturally, it's really difficult, and so the whole organization has to learn how to work through that, both from identify the constraint, but also just how to navigate that with the human side of it, and as well as the kind of tactical, right brain stuff. We'll get a lot more into the psychology of stuff as we get into it. So we're not going to go into this one, but this is just kind of like the two main areas of the contractor's business model: the project value stream and the talent value stream. Just start there. Start, sit with your team and really look at it. And you don't even have to pick it. Just put some dots on these of going, where are the bottlenecks, where are the constraints, and really take a look at it and start to see how you're aligned with your team, see what you think. If you want to, run it by and have a confidential conversation off to the side, definitely reach out or something. We'll talk to anybody. This is just, we're trying to make the world better a little bit. So, but this is where we would start most of the time. Just internal is with these two areas, and don't forget your critical supporting operations and all those, but layer those in after you've identified the bottlenecks and constraints in these two big value streams going through the organization, and then start to layer in and say, okay, purchasing, might be a constraint, or equipment, resources might be, a bottleneck right now. Like we've got a civil contractor that has to make a really big decision to commit literally millions of dollars to buy certain pieces of equipment to go do a different type of work. And right now they're kind of in between because they don't have the work. They don't want to go commit the resources, but they can't really go after the work until they commit the resources. It's like kind of one of those chicken and egg things. And but at least we know it and we're talking about it very, very actively. That seems very simple, but it's harder to recognize at scale than it seems. Any comments here before we move on to the real people side of this?
Well, just one more example, right, of another contractor of one that just does piling, and they wanted to go out and bid this massive job, but again, looking at what they had to do, they would have had to pony up for all of the materials, all of the pile that had to be in, and they were going to be out of pocket for probably, I don't know, 300 or 400 of those things while they were installing them with no material on hand payments. And the payment terms were like 90 days. And so again, they had to go through and look at where were the constraints, and it turned out their constraint was cash, right? What were they going to do, and could they even build this? Could they get enough bank financing to build this job until all the payments came in? So it turned out not to be equipment. It turned out not to be people. It turned out to be cash. But again, backing into it and really paying attention to what the constraint is as to whether they were going to go down the road on this job or not.
So let me get, was it utility scale solar that was needed the piles, or I'm trying to think what the customer dynamic could be on 90-day payment terms, because I got an add-on story to that also has to do with piles, different contractor.
Yeah, well, I tell you, well, this example was up in Canada. They had leveled out how they were going to pay.
Okay.
It didn't matter, one, how fast you put it in. It didn't make any difference. They were going to pay over this amount of time, and it was going to be 90 days. So if you were going to speed up your schedule, if you accelerated the schedule, again, that cash was all on you. Besides,
it was just worse on your cash flow, so you had to balance.
That's right.
So cool, not cool in the 90-day payment terms, but again, every project's a little bit different. When one person's good cash flow becomes another person's bad cash flow, that's just the way the world works. But yeah, we had a similar thing on, and it's cool that the contractor you're talking about did that analysis up front and kind of walked into it with eyes wide open. We saw a contractor walk into it with eyes closed, only focusing on the profitability of it and not focusing on the cash flow aspect of it. And it put them in a position where they actually had to go sell the company. And so, the company's still there, but they had to go sell it and take on some other equity from another company, and it was because they walked into that situation enamored with the profitability on the project, not mapping out the cash flow aspect of it. And cash will shut you down instantly. It's like losing blood. You're only going to make it 3 or 4 seconds before you black out, and you got seconds more before you're brain damaged and dead. So cash is king. So